lectures we shall be concerned with sketching the origins and the developments of eschatological expectations in the Old Testament, and particularly the form that these expectations took in the preaching of the pre-exilic prophets. And although it may seem illogical to do so, we shall take our start with the book of Jeremiah. The subject was in fact suggested to me by a problem that rises in connection with that prophet's career. It was a problem that plagued Jeremiah all his life, one that arose from the fact that his view of his country's future and that of the vast majority of his contemporaries was simply not the same, and from his inability to convince anyone much that his view might well be the correct one. Jeremiah lived, of course, in the last days of the kingdom of Judah, and all his life the burning question before the nation was the question of survival. From the days of Josiah's reform through the dark days of the Babylonian advance into the west and on down to the end, the question was always, what course ought this country to follow in order to secure its future? What must it do if it is even to survive? Will it survive? Now Jeremiah clearly became convinced that it would not survive. And as the years wore on, he said so ever more plainly, till in the end his message became the flat announcement that the Babylonians would take the city, destroy it, bring the Davidic dynasty to an end, carry the people into exile in a far country, and that in so doing they were God's own agents of judgment upon the nation for its refusal to heed his word. But what is equally clear is that this was not the majority opinion. Indeed, it was quite dangerous to express this opinion, and anyone who has read the Jeremiah book knows that Jeremiah on many occasions nearly lost his life for expressing it. In a word, Jeremiah's contemporaries had radically other views of the nation's future, and they found Jeremiah's view unacceptable, false, dangerous, blasphemous. Now, so explosive a tension is not to be explained merely as a difference of political opinion. Oh, it was that, of course. And Jeremiah's opponents, whatever else you may say of them, ardent patriots, clearly regarded Jeremiah as a defeatist and a traitor. But this was no collision between patriotic men who had calculated the odds, believed their country could win through, and a pessimist who had likewise weighed the odds and thought it didn't have a chance. Least of all was it a clash between a man of sincere theological convictions, Jeremiah, and people who didn't have any convictions. Whatever we may think of those who persecuted and opposed Jeremiah, there's not the slightest reason for saying they were insincere. Jeremiah himself made no such accusation. The truth is that Jeremiah and his opponents had equally strong theological convictions. Jeremiah was convinced on theological grounds that the nation was under judgment and would be destroyed. His opponents were convinced likewise on theological grounds that such a thing could never happen. God wouldn't allow it. He'd intervene in the nick of time with a miracle and save the nation. The fact that they drove their country to suicide does not alter the sincerity of their convictions. It was a collision precisely in the realm of theology, a clash between two ways of understanding the nation's relationship to its God and its future under God, a clash regarding the nature of God's election of his people and his promises to them, a clash, you might say, regarding where it's all going to end up. It would not be too wrong to call it a clash within the realm of eschatology. Now, how could such a thing be? Now, to answer that question, we have to go a long way back and ask after the nature and origins of eschatological expectations in Israel. But first of all, the definition: in what sense are we using that word eschatology? It's always good to begin with definitions, lest we find we're talking about two different things, and it's especially desirable in this case because the word has been used in different ways. For example, here is one scholar who will discuss the eschatology of the 8th century prophets, may even discuss a pre-prophetic eschatology, while another scholar, equally competent, will say yes, we didn't have any eschatology till well on in the post-exilic period. Then you read again, discover they're talking about the same thing, but operating with different sets of definitions. Thus, for example, the distinguished Norwegian scholar, the late Sigmund Mowinckel, defined eschatology as a developed doctrine or complex of ideas about the last things, which involved a dualistic conception of the course of history, the conflict of divine and demonic powers, and which looked for the catastrophic end of this present age and the ushering in of a new and better age by the power of God. And with that definition, Mowinckel refused to speak of eschatology till the end of the Old Testament period. Now, if that definition is right, Mowinckel is right. Eschatology is a late phenomenon. Early Israel had no doctrine of the end of the world, the last judgment, resurrection to eternal life beyond the grave, and the like. But one wonders if this is not imposing our definition of eschatology upon the Old Testament, and then complaining that it has very little eschatology as we would define the term. Is it proper to what we find in the Old Testament? For my part, with the majority, we shall be prepared to use the word in a broader sense. For, as Mowinckel fully agrees, Israel from a very early period had an orientation toward the future, a future hope that was characteristic and unique. Perhaps in the popular mind, this was no more than the expectation of good things to come, victory, blessing, prosperity for the nation. But in the pre-exilic prophets, this had become the expectation of a definitive divine intervention through which he would judge, then in the yet for the future redeem his people and bring his purposes for them to a triumphant conclusion. Moreover, as you know, the 8th century prophets developed certain definite patterns to describe this future intervention. These became classic, were retained by later generations, and used in a variety of ways. For instance, Isaiah's hope of the ideal kingly figure whom we see described in his book. Now, this is not eschatology in the later Jewish or Christian sense. There is no a supra-historical termination of things, no end of the world. The terminus is on this earth in history, yet it is a terminus, the consummation of the divine purpose beyond which the prophets saw no need to look and in fact did not look. I've often wondered that if I should ever have the privilege of meeting Isaiah on the heavenly streets and were to ask him, sir, what did you look for to happen after that kingly figure whom you described in the 9th and 11th chapters of your book? I imagine he would rear up to his full height and say, after that, man, what are you talking about? That was it. That was the eschaton. And so I think it proper to use the eschatology in the sense just the term, in the sense defined as far back as the 8th century prophets. But the 8th century prophets did not originate Israel's future hope. They gave it classical form, but they did not invent it. The people to whom they spoke already had a lively hope for the future. To mention only one example, Amos cries out, "Are you that eagerly desire the day of Yahweh?" Now that's chronologically the first mention of the day of Yahweh in the Bible. Yet it is plain from his words that Amos is not introducing a novel concept. He does not say, my people, I have information for you. There's going to be the day of Yahweh. He addressed people who already were eagerly yearning for the day of Yahweh. And it is to be noted that Amos in no way denied the validity of that hope. Rather, he upended it and stood it on its head. Are you that eagerly desire the day of Yahweh? What do you want with the day of Yahweh? It's darkness, not light. There will indeed be a day of Yahweh, but it will not be what you think it will be. So the prophets, we see, did not originate Israel's future hope. They gave it classical form, but they by no means originated it. They worked with concepts, beliefs, traditions already at home in the minds of their hearers. Now it would be interesting to ask where this future hope so characteristic of Israel came from, but that would lead us far too far afield for the time at our disposal. Enough to say that we can give no superficial answers to that, but that Israel's orientation to the future must ultimately be sought in the nature of the faith that had brought her into existence as a people in the first place. A note of promise for the future was indeed characteristic of Israel's faith as far back as we can trace it. Was indeed one of its most characteristic features. Again, we can't discuss earliest Israel's faith in general. That would be too great a subject. Enough to say that it was a phenomenon unique in the ancient world, different from the pagan religions fundamentally and in 1,000 ways. It was not anchored to the rhythmic pattern of nature, the fertility of the soil and the cycles of seasons, but to the memory of historical events. It rested in Israel's conviction that her God had chosen her, made covenant with her, and extended his promises to her. Now this understanding of reality is clearly reflected in the narrative of the first 6 books of the Bible, is indeed its overarching theme. Here we read how God called Abraham, promised him land, posterity, and blessing, how after his descendants had suffered hard bondage in Egypt, he led them forth in the Exodus miracle, gave them his covenant and law at Sinai, then led them on to through the desert to give them the promised land. The whole story of Exodus, wilderness wandering, land giving is seen there as the fulfillment of the promise made to the fathers. And on the surface, this would seem to offer us a theologically harmonious and coherent picture. Yet even here one may see, as George Mendenhall was the first to point out, hints of 2 understandings of Israel's election and relationship to her God. And there were 2 possible ways of understanding the future. They're not intrinsically incompatible, but the emphases are so different that the possibility of a real tension is present. Both are very primitive, and both are associated with the word covenant. On the one hand, we read of the covenant made with Abraham. This is a theme that is struck for the first time when Abram is called in Genesis 12. Go from your country, your kindred, your father's house, to the land that I will show you. And I'll make of you a great nation, and I'll bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and him who curses you I will curse, and in you will all the families of the earth bless themselves. This theme recurs again and again through the book of Genesis, but surely its clearest illustration is in the 15th chapter, where the transaction is explicitly called a covenant. You know the story. Abraham, in effect, questions the promise. What is this, my Lord? You said I will be a great nation, but that is impossible. I am now an old man, and I haven't even got a son. And the story goes on. Abraham is asked to count the stars if he can. So numerous will his seed be. And then we read, Abraham believed God, and he counted it to him for tzedakah, the right thing. And then, in a solemn ceremony, God tells him that after generations of hard bondage, he will possess the land. On that day, Yahweh made a covenant with Abraham. To your descendants, I will give this land. Now, it's to be noted that the covenant described here is really depicted as a binding promise on the part of God, a promissory oath. No particular conditions are attached to it. God does not say, Abraham, if you keep my law and walk according to my statutes and ordinances, then I will give you. No, I will give you this land. In fact, in the ceremony, Abram is depicted as passive. He's in a trance. God himself, symbolized by the smoking fire pot and the flaming torch, moves between the parts of the sacrificial animals, thus binding himself in a solemn self-curse that he will make his promises good. The patriarchal covenant, thus based in God's unconditional promises for the future, and it asks of the recipient only that he trust. Now, this understanding of the God-people relationship is surely very ancient in Israel. That's a subject we cannot follow up. Indeed, Albrecht Alt some years ago argued cogently that the belief that their God had promised them land and numerous posterity was an original element in the religion of those wandering northwest Semitic herdsmen who were Israel's ultimate ancestors. Perhaps originally taken by these wandering folk, no more than a promise that they'd one day have land of their own and become a very large clan indeed. We may suppose as their descendants settled on the soil of Palestine, contributed to the bloodstream of Israel, that their descendants could view the land they held as promised land, their title to it resting in the sure promises of God to their ancestors, and their possession of it for all the future guaranteed by the same unconditional promises. But as you know, we encounter in the Hexateuch still another pattern of covenant, that of the covenant made at Sinai. This covenant was constitutive of Israel. It brought her into being as a people. Early and late, Israel remembered the events of Exodus as the definitive act of divine grace whereby God with his mighty acts had called out of bondage to himself. And early and late, she viewed these events as the basis of her bond with him and obligation to him. She would recite them, and on the basis of them would affirm that she had obligation to her God. This is expressed many places in the Old Testament, perhaps most clearly in certain confessional type passages embedded in Deuteronomy, which Van Rad argued were quite old. We can't go into that. For example, in chapter 26, I paraphrase, the tribesman would bring the basket of the first fruits of his crop to the shrine. He would stand there before the altar and make confessio fidei. A wandering Aramean was my father. He went down to Egypt, few in number. The Egyptians oppressed us harsh and sore. We cried to Yahweh our God. He heard our cry. With a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, he brought us from thence to this good land as it is this day. Now my gifts. Obligation based in prevenient grace. One sees that also in the account in Joshua 24 of the covenant ceremony at Shechem, where Joshua makes a speech and he reviews the Magnalia Dei toward his people, beginning with the call of Abraham right down to that very hour. And there says, now then you've heard this, choose which God you will have. As for me, I've made my choice. And on the basis of the recitation of the mighty acts of God toward Israel, the people enter into covenant with him to worship him alone. Once more, obligation assumed on the basis of prevenient grace. And Israel did in fact come into history as a covenant society. This is a hotly discussed question, and we'll just have to brush it aside this morning. For 200 years after her settlement in Palestine, she had no statehood, no central government, no administrative machinery, no standing army, and above all, God help us, no king. She was a loose league of clans united in covenant with Yahweh. The focal point of the league was the shrine that housed the Ark of the Covenant, the portable throne of the invisible deity. Times of danger, there would arise a judge upon whom the Spirit of Yahweh would rush, and seized by the charismatic fury, he would rally the clans and repel the foe. And though his victories won him prestige, the judge was in no sense a king. Indeed, the whole notion of monarchy was rejected as improper. You remember when they tried to make Gideon king, Judges 8, after his victory, and how he replied, I will not rule over you, my son will not rule over you, Yahweh rules over you, didn't you know that? He lectures of them as though they should have known that Yahweh is the king of the league, nobody else. And the sarcastic fable of Jotham in the next chapter, the trees went to elect a king. They asked the olive tree, I'm too busy. They asked the fig tree, same reply. They asked the grapevine, should I leave my wine that gladdens the hearts of gods and men to come reign over you? No. So they asked the bramble bush, and the bramble was glad to be their king. Can anybody miss the sarcasm of it? The league had no king save Yahweh. Its wars were his holy wars. He won the victory, and to him alone was allegiance owed. Now all this is perfectly expressive of the Sinaitic covenant as described in the Bible. I'm treading through a minefield here, and I know it, but we cannot pause on the debating of issues. The Sinaitic covenant follows the pattern of international suzerainty treaty, overlord-vassal, such as we know best, but not exclusively, from texts of the Hittite Empire. In these treaties, the overlord addresses his vassal directly, I to thou. He begins by identifying himself, and then reviews at some length past relationships between the two, with stress upon his own beneficent acts toward the vassal, which should obligate the latter to perpetual gratitude. And then he lays down the stipulations which the vassal must meet. They vary, but typically one finds that the vassal is to engage in no foreign relations with any other overlord, except through the great king. Controversies with other vassals are to be submitted to the great king for adjustment. The vassal is to respond to the call to arms, and he is to do so with all your heart. The vassal is to appear regularly before the overlord with the stipulated tribute, and so on and so on. At the end, it is frequently directed that a copy of the treaty shall be placed in the vassal's shrine, periodically brought out and read in public. And the whole concludes with a series of blessings and curses in the name of the gods who have witnessed the treaty, the blessings in the event of obedience, the curses vice versa. Now we can't trace it, but most of these features have their parallels in the Israelite covenant. For example, when you read the Decalogue in Exodus 20, how does it begin? I am Yahweh your God, self-identification, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, past gracious act. Now then, no other God but me. You can see the correspondence in the pattern, though the subject is very moot. Thus the Sinaitic covenant was anything but a bargain between equals which could be canceled or adjusted by arbitration. It was a vassal's acceptance of the overlord's terms. It rested in the recognition of his prior grace and unlimited power, and it issued in no unconditional promises, but in binding obligation upon the lesser party to the treaty, with the threat of the overlord's wrath in the event of disobedience. And with such a view of a God-people relationship, Israel, you would think, must always see the future as subject to conditions. The future is not assured by the promise. It may be blessing, may be curse. All the future is laid under the little word if. Thus, for example, in the classic covenant formulation in Exodus 19, Moses speaks in the name of God. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my own possession, etc., etc., etc. No room for complacency there, you would think. And yet the future is left open. If there is the threat of the overlord's wrath in the event of disobedience, there is also the explicit assurance that if the stipulations of covenant are met, the overlord's favor will be endlessly continued. Such a belief does not make for complacency, no, but it doesn't make for despair either. The future is open unto God, who is faithful and powerful. And as a matter of fact, earliest Israel did exhibit an exuberant confidence in the future. We know this from certain of the very earliest poems which are embedded in the early books of the Bible, and which on internal grounds and philological grounds are well believed to go way back to the very, very beginning of Israel's history. You will have to read them at your leisure. I think of such pieces as the poems of Balaam in Numbers 23:24, the blessing of Moses in Deuteronomy 33, the blessing of Jacob in Genesis 49, the song of Miriam in Exodus 15, not to mention the song of Deborah in Judges 5. And here again and again we hear the theme. Israel is a people set apart, protected by Yahweh, against whom no foe, no curse can avail. Defended by the God who brought her from Egypt to give her a land. She faces a future of unimagined blessing. Let us read just one example from Deuteronomy 33. Blessed by Yahweh be his land, with the choicest gifts of heaven above, of the deep that couches beneath, the choicest fruits of the sun, the rich yield of the months, the finest produce of the ancient mountains, the abundance of the everlasting hills. Is he talking about Palestine or paradise? A blessing that seems far to outrun reality. And then how it concludes. There is none like the God of Yeshurun, Israel, who rides the heavens to your help, in his majesty the clouds. The eternal God is your dwelling place beneath the everlasting arms. He thrust out the enemy before you, gave the word to destroy. So Israel dwelt in safety, the fountain of Jacob, is something in the text there, alone in a land of grain and wine. Yes, his heavens drip down dew. Happy are you, O Israel, who is like you, a people saved by Yahweh, the shield of your help, the sword of your triumph. Your enemies shall come fawning to you, and you tread upon their backs. So the confidence of the tribesmen of very earliest Israel, that the God who had been gracious in the past would continue to be so through the indefinite future. But another factor in shaping Israel's future hope was the great achievement of royal David. Under David and his son Solomon, as you well know, Israel reached the golden age of its prosperity and glory. We can't stop to trace the events of the rise of the monarchy, how after 200 years of existence the tribal league was broken by the Philistines, the ark captured, its priests slain, the shrine of Shiloh destroyed. How Israel's shameful position led to the demand for a king, and the king was elected, Saul. How Saul won initial victories and then became insanely jealous of the young hero David and ended his career in mental disintegration, defeat, and tragic death. Upon Saul's death, it was of course David who took hold of beaten Israel, and in a few short years it made it the dominant power in Palestine and Syria. Again, we can't trace David's brilliant career. Enough to say, he united Israel in his person as it had never been united before. With his tough little army, he broke the back of the Philistines, pinned them down there along the seashore where they'd never be a menace again. He took the Canaanite Jebusite city of Jerusalem and made it his capital and personal holding, and shortly to that city he brought the sacred object of the old league, the Ark of the Covenant, and established it in a tent shrine established for the purpose there, and more. And to cap the climax, of course, David went on to win a considerable foreign empire. A new Israel emerged. And what is more, David was able to found a dynasty. This was absolutely an innovation in Israel. The judges of old had been charismatic heroes. Their victory won, none reigned as king, none passed the power to his son. Saul had risen like the judges of old, and though his rule was recognized as permanent, he too could not pass the power on to his son. With David, it was different. It had to be. The structure he built was so uniquely his achievement and so centered in his person that it must have become evident to all that if he should die, only a son could hold this patchwork thing together. By the time he was old, the question wasn't anymore, will David's son succeed him, but which one of them will? And though Solomon took the throne by a rather cheap palace intrigue, the people seem to have accepted him. Now, changes as radical as the monarchy brought caused tension that ultimately tore it apart. We cannot go into these things. And yet, in spite of these tensions, which the monarchy never bridged, David made an unforgettable impression. Not only did he bring Israel to heights of power and glory undreamed of before and only to be dreamed of later, all the land by the widest stretch of the imagination thought of as promised was now for the first and the last time Israel. It must have seemed to many that the promises of God to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob fulfilled in the land giving had now been amply fulfilled in great David, the author of Kings, who gave us the account of Solomon's reign, and he reaped David's achievement, puts it so, 1 Kings 4:20. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. Where do you read that word? Abraham. They ate and drank and were happy. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt. Read Genesis 15, the dimensions of the land promised. All promises have been fulfilled in David. Will they not now be extended through David to all the future? In any event, a theology grew up about Jerusalem and David that became official in the temple cult under the monarchy. Its essence was, God has chosen Mount Zion as the seat of his earthly rule, there to dwell among his people forever and protect them from their foes. And he's promised to David a dynasty that will never end. Oh yes, a sinful king can bring chastisement on himself and his people, but God will never take his gracious favor from David's line. On the contrary, it will rule forever, be given victory over all its foes, and a wide domain with the kings of the earth fawning at its feet. We see this theology expressed in numerous places. We lack the time to read them all, but read that oracle of Nathan to David in 2 Samuel 7. I have not time to read it now. It has many other expressions. And this theology was affirmed in the cult. We know this from the fact that it finds its clearest expression in certain of the Psalms, particularly in the royal Psalms, also in the hymns of Zion, which, though none of them can be dated with precision, all reflect the beliefs of ancient Israelites as expressed in the cult of the temple in the days of the monarchy. I suspect you see it as clearly as anywhere in Psalm 89. It's a long one. We can't read it all. It begins with a recitation of the gracious favor of God to David. Thou hast said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one, have sworn to David my servant, I'll establish your descendants forever, build your throne to all generations. And then after a long picture of Yahweh's might in all creation, the theme resumes in verse 19. We can't follow it. David is God's chosen king. No enemy will ever outwit him or defeat him. His seed will be exalted. I will set his hand on the sea, his right hand on the rivers. He'll rule everything. He shall cry to me, my Father art thou, my God, the rock of my salvation. I'll make him my firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth, and so on. If his children forsake my law, do not walk according to my ordinances, if they violate my statutes and do not keep my commandments, then I'll punish their transgressions with the rod, their iniquity with the whip. But I'll not take from him my gracious favor, nor be false to my faithfulness. I'll not violate my covenant, nor alter what passed from my lips. Once for all I have sworn, God is the speaker, by my holiness, my Godhood, never would I lie to David. His line shall endure forever, his throne like the sun before me, like the moon established forever, firm while the skies endure. Here are the beliefs of Judahites under the monarchy. What people sing in church does usually very closely reflect what they believe. We are not just reading rhetoric. We are reading things that were most surely believed and affirmed in the cult of the Jerusalem temple. And there are many other such psalms. I wish we could read them all. Psalm 78, which is not a royal psalm. We will allude to it briefly, and then I'll have to leave the rest to your own reading. This is a reflection on the Heilsgeschichte, beginning with Egypt and coming down to David's day. And when we get over near the end, in verse 60, it is said of God, he forsook his dwelling at Shiloh, the tent where he dwelt among men, delivered his power to captivity, his glory to the hand of the foe. You don't imagine the Philistines just did that. No, they did it because Yahweh ceded it to them. They took Shiloh because he'd already left it. Then we read, he rejected the tent of Joseph, didn't choose the tribe of Ephraim. He chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loves. He built his sanctuary like I have. You don't think Solomon built it? No, God built it. Like the earth, founded forever, he chose David, his servant, etc. The double theme of the eternal choice of Mount Zion as Yahweh's earthly palace, and of the Davidic line to rule forever. Read also Psalm 132. Read Psalm 72, where the royal ideal is at the clearest. This is a prayer for the king, uttered on his coronation day, and it begins, give to the king thy justice, O God, thy righteousness to the royal son. May he judge thy people with righteousness, thy poor with equity. The king was supposed to be the agent of putting into effect Yahweh's righteous law in society. It was a lofty ideal, but there are many more and we can't go into them. Psalm 2 is another. Also read the Zion hymns. Psalm 46, 48, 76. God is our refuge and strength, a well-tried help in time of trouble. Therefore will we not fear, though the earth should wobble and the mountains slip into the midst of the sea. For God is in Zion and will protect us. Well, we must bring this to a conclusion. It will be evident that the Davidic covenant approximates the patriarchal. Now there is a difference. The king was obligated to do justice and otherwise to obey God's commands, and he was threatened with a beating if he didn't. Nor was any limit placed upon how severe the chastisement might be short of the fall of the dynasty. Yet the stress falls on the promise, and these are without condition. The dynasty will continue. The nation is secure because Yahweh has so promised. He may discipline king and people, and he may discipline severely, but he will never forsake his eternal covenant with David. And in this promise, the king was obligated, like Abraham, to trust. Some boast of horses, some boast of chariots, says the king in the psalm. We boast in the name of Yahweh our God. Isaiah's going to take that one and play tunes on it, as we shall see later. Now, such a theology must have given the nation an amazing confidence with regard to the future, which had its blessings and its dangers. And we may imagine, as the eternal promises of David were reaffirmed in the cult, the Sinaitic covenant with its stern stipulations tended to get pushed into the background. We shouldn't generalize about that too broadly, because memory of this covenant never died out in Israel, and there were parts of Israel, North Israel, where the notion that David alone was entitled to rule in perpetuity was always anathema. And yet even in North Israel, it would seem that the theology of covenant had been by the 8th century widely prostituted. Feasts of covenant renewal were held and the saving events recited. But if we take Amos seriously, it would seem that the whole notion of covenant had been externalized. The notion established itself that its stipulations could be met by cultic observance alone, and since this is being done, the covenant is being maintained, and our future under God is therefore secure. As in the past, so in the future, he will always come to our rescue with his mighty acts and deliver us. Now, such an optimistic confidence simply couldn't survive. It had a head-on collision with reality. A rescue with his mighty acts and deliverance. Now, such an optimistic confidence simply couldn't survive. It had a head-on collision with reality. The events of the 9th, 8th century must have put it under an awful strain. The great days of the Davidic Empire now no more in the fond memory. Israel and Judah, two petty states, often invaded, defeated, and at length faced with the rising power of Assyria and threatened with total destruction. The promises affirmed in the cult and reality did not in the least correspond. And under these circumstances, men could not be satisfied with the continuation of the present state of affairs. They had to look out for a better future which would amount to a reversal of the present state of affairs. And there seems to have grown up a longing for the now idealized lost glories of the past and a divine intervention that would recover them. In Judah, naturally, this took the form of a yearning for the lost glories of David. We may have an echo of that in some of the last verses of Amos' book, where it is said, "In that day, Yahweh the speaker, I will raise up again the tumbled down hut of David." Restore it as in the good old days. It is probably in this context that the popular hope for the day of Yahweh arose. Penrod is probably right. Had its origin in the recollection of the great days of Yahweh's holy wars in the past, and was a yearning for him to come again and do his mighty acts. You see, the popular day of Yahweh was not the last day. It was a day like the great days of the past. Surely there'll be another, a time when Yahweh will come again to the aid of his people. Now, in conclusion, none of this is to be understood as an eschatology. Not at all. The day of Yahweh was, as I've said, not the day, it was a day of God's intervention like the great ones of the past. This was not a hope for the terminus of God's purpose in history or some great turning point in his plan in history. Rather, it was the hope for Yahweh to come and to put things back as they ideally should be and as they were cultically affirmed to be. That, of course, is not eschatology, but the very popular hope, as we shall see next time, powerfully shaped the future promise of the great 8th century prophets, and we'll have to come back to them then. I thank you, and we'll continue on that theme tomorrow.